You think you're invisible, don't you? Nathan Hayes's voice slices through the din, sharp and mocking, his whiskey glass glinting under the dim lights. I freeze my fingers tightening around a cheap plastic pen standing at the edge of a rooftop lounge atop Nexus Innovations' Seattle headquarters. The Puget Sound sparkles below a cold mirror to the tech elite swirling around me, venture capitalists in slim-fit suits, data scientists trading buzzwords like blockchain and generative AI. Nathan Nexus's star VP leans against a steel railing. His grin a weapon, his posse, Ethan Brooks, Caleb Mitchell, Ryan Walsh snickering at his side. Claire, he calls again louder, drawing eyes, still tinkering with those Buggy scripts. Maybe try a barista gig, better tips. Laughter erupts, a polished, cruel sound, as heads turn my way. I'm Claire Evans to them, a low-rung coder, drowning in Nexus's engineering pool, my thrift store blazer, and scuffed boots, screaming nobody. But I'm not. I'm Claire Thompson, the Shadow CEO, who built Nexus into a cloud computing titan, hiding behind a proxy to watch my enemies. Nathan's jab isn't just personal, it's a power play, reminding everyone he's the king here. I force a shy smile, my heart pounding, and glance at my phone hidden in my pocket. A new message blinks, code transfer prepped, Port of Seattle, 36 hours. Nathan's not just mocking me, he's selling my AI to a dark web buyer, a deal that could weaponize my life's work. I meet his gaze, my eyes flickering with something he can't read. He doesn't know I've been tracking him for a year, my encrypted server holding every email, every dirty dollar. He doesn't know I'm one step from exposing him. But doubt claws at me. 5 years of lies, of playing the weak wife, have cost me everything. One misstep, and I lose it all. Nathan raises his glass, his voice dripping. To the little people who keep us grounded, I lift my pen, my whisper soft, to secrets unveiled soon. He laughs oblivious, but his eyes narrow. Something's off. Good. Let him sweat, because in 36 hours, I'll shatter his world, or risk mine crumbling. Want to know how? Keep watching. You're not cut out for this game, Claire, Nathan Hayes says. His voice low-laced with pity as he swirls his bourbon at the edge of the rooftop lounge. The Seattle skyline glitters beyond the glass railing of Nexus Innovations headquarters, a sprawl of ambition under a drizzle-soaked sky. I stand by a high-top table, my faded cardigan blending into the crowd of tech moguls and angel investors. Their chatter thick with talk of cloud scalability and AI ethics. My plastic coffee cup trembles slightly in my hand. Nathan's words stinging like salt on a cut. To them, I'm Claire Evans, a junior software engineer at Nexus scraping by on pull requests and bug fixes. But I'm Claire Thompson, the Shadow CEO, who built this cloud computing empire, hiding behind a proxy to keep my enemies in check. Nathan, my husband, is the closest one of all. Nathan commands the room, his tailored blazer sharp, his smile a polished blade. As Nexus's vice president, he's Seattle's tech darling, all charm and calculated quips. His crew, Ethan Brooks, Caleb Mitchell, Ryan Walsh flank him. Their REI vests and minimalist sneakers, a badge of privilege. Nathan's eyes lock on me again, his grin widening. Babe, you still chasing that promotion? He calls loud enough for the crowd to turn. Stick to debugging, huh? Leave the big plays to us. Ethan chuckles, leaning in. Nate's a saint, bankrolling a coder with no startup cred. My cheeks burn, but I keep my head low, forcing a meek nod. They think I'm the charity case the wife Nathan props up with his 6-figure bonuses. They don't know I wrote the kernel for Nexus's cloud platform, the one powering half the Fortune 500. They don't know I chose this lie 5 years ago. It started at a Belltown hackathon where Nathan's earnest pitch and easy laugh drew me in. I was already Nexus's secret architect, running the company through my proxy COO Lauren Kim to dodge the spotlight and protect my vision. But I wanted love, not fame, so I told Nathan I was a struggling coder, renting a tiny Capitol Hill apartment, driving a rusty Subaru. He was supportive then, cheering my side hustles. But as he rose at Nexus, his kindness soured. My failure became his leverage, my silence his stage. Now I'm his prop mocked at galas, like this one a toast to Nexus's new AI-driven analytics suite. To the grinders who keep us shining. Nathan raises his glass, his eyes on me, the jab clear. I sip my coffee, the bitterness sharp, and bite back the truth. I could claim my title now, watch his world crack, but I don't. Nathan's not just cruel, he's a traitor. A year ago, I found a USB drive in his briefcase, tucked under gym socks. Its files were encrypted, but Zoe Chen, my dark web-savvy cybersecurity hire, cracked them. A single email chain hit like a punch. Nathan discussing data extraction with a contact called Shade, tied to a dark web marketplace. My AI built to secure clouds was being shopped to a buyer who'd turn it into a hacking tool. Nathan, Ethan, Caleb, and Ryan were in deep funneling Nexus funds through fake AWS invoices to a Belize account. The deal was set for the port of Seattle, 36 hours away. If it went through, Nexus would implode, and my tech would fuel cyber attacks on a global scale. I didn't scream or cry. I got to work. Zoe became my shadow, tracing their crypto wallets and scraping burner apps. Lauren fed me boardroom leaks, her loyalty to my secret unwavering. But proof was elusive. Nathan's crew used VPNs and coded slang payload for the AI dock for the port. Zoe hit firewalls, nearly exposing us, when Caleb, Nexus's CTO, flagged a latency spike in our servers. My surveillance script, hidden in the cloud, was pinging too hard. Zoe spoofed the trace to a Vancouver IP, but my palms sweated for days. Nathan noticed his voice casual but probing over dinner. "You seem stressed, Claire. Work trouble." I laughed my throat tight and blamed a crashed build. One slip and I'd lose everything. I needed their world up close, the rot they'd sown in my company. So I became Sarah Lee, a UW grad with a shaky LinkedIn and a thin portfolio. I applied for a machine learning role at Nexus, my resume crafted to look earnest but unpolished. In a thrift store blouse and scuffed loafers, I faced Ethan, Caleb, and Ryan in a sterile 8th floor meeting room. Ethan tossed my resume aside, smirking. "Sarah, you built a sentiment classifier?" "That's open source stuff." Caleb scrolled his phone, bored. "What's your impact?" "We don't hire dreamers," I stumbled. "I've optimized models for real-time analytics." Ryan laughed, texting. "Try a boot camp, kid. This ain't your league." Their phones pinged in unison. Ethan glanced at his snickering. "Nate's cracking up. Says his wife's got a new intern." Nathan's text, sent from a Bainbridge ferry, burned through me. I left my thank you soft, but my mind was razor sharp. Nexus wasn't a company, it was a clique crushing talent to feed egos. That interview wasn't a loss. It was a spark, but doubt crept in. Alone in my apartment, staring at Zoe's latest decrypted email about payload delivery, I faltered. 5 years of lies of playing small had drained me. Was I fighting for Nexus or for revenge? I almost called Lauren, ready to quit, But then I thought of Rachel Park, an engineer Nathan blackmailed into leaving for questioning his billing errors. Her story, shared over a Fremont diner coffee, kept me going. She deserved truth. So did I. Nathan thinks he's won his deal ticking down. He thinks I'm his shadow too weak to rise. But I've got Zoe's files, Lauren's intel, and a plan. The shareholder meeting at the Seattle Convention Center is my moment. I'll expose him, his crew, their crime. But fear whispers, what if I'm wrong? What if I've become the villain? I silence it. Nathan's laughter still rings in my ears. He's underestimated me for the last time. Soon he'll face the real Claire Thompson, and there'll be nowhere to hide. The Seattle rain taps against my Capitol Hill apartment window, a restless rhythm matching the churn in my chest. My laptop's glow is the only light in this shoebox studio, casting jagged shadows across the thrift store desk, where I'm waging a silent war. To Nexus Innovations. I'm Claire Evans, a junior coder lost in the grind of pull requests and Jira tickets. But here I'm Claire Thompson, the shadow CEO, dismantling a betrayal that could gut my cloud computing empire. My fingers glide over the keyboard, pulling up a hidden dashboard I wove into Nexus's servers, a digital snare capturing Nathan Hayes' every move. The truth is close, but it's a tightrope, and one misstep could send me crashing. A year ago, that USB drive in Nathan's briefcase ripped my world apart. Zoe Chen, my cybersecurity lifeline who navigates dark web backchannels, like a ghost, decrypted its files, emails between Nathan and Shade, a dark web alias discussing data extraction for millions. My AI, the heart of Nexus's cloud security, was being prepped for a black market sale to a buyer tied to a Chinese hacking syndicate. Nathan, my husband and Nexus's VP, wasn't just greedy, he was reckless, ready to weaponize my code for cash. Ethan Brooks, Caleb Mitchell, and Ryan Walsh, his inner circle, were complicit laundering Nexus funds through fake SaaS subscriptions to a Cayman account. The handoff was set for the port of Seattle 36 hours away. If it went through, Nexus would collapse and my tech would fuel chaos. I didn't confront him. I built a machine to bury him. Zoe became my shadow, cracking encrypted Slack threads and tracing crypto wallets. Lauren Kim, my proxy COO, slipped me boardroom leaks while guarding my CEO secret. But proof was a maze of dead-ends, burner apps, VPNs, coded slang like cargo for the AI. Zoe's sweeps hit a wall when Ryan Walsh Nexus's careless ops guy ran a network diagnostic that pinged my surveillance script. My heart slammed as error logs lit up my code, too loud in the system. Zoe rerouted the trace to a burner server in Portland, but Nathan's radar twitched. Over coffee at our sterile Queen Anne loft, he probed, his voice too smooth. "You look tense, Claire. Code not playing nice." I forced a laugh, blaming a sprint crunch, my palms slick. One wrong breath and I'd be done. Digital clues weren't enough. I needed their world, the venom they'd let fester in my company. So I crafted Sarah Miller, a UW dropout, with a shaky GitHub and a nervous smile. I applied for a data engineering role at Nexus, my resume, a study in mediocrity. In a wrinkled button-up and scuffed sneakers, I faced Ethan, Caleb, and Ryan in a 9th floor conference room, its walls plastered with agile sticky notes. Ethan skimmed my CV, his smirk razor thin. "Sarah, you optimized? What a traffic model." "That's hackathon fodder." Caleb, scrolling X, didn't look up. "Why should we bet on a nobody?" I fumbled. "I've built pipelines for real-time metrics." Ryan snorted, texting, "Stick to tutorials, kid. This is Nexus." Their laughter was a knife, but I leaned into the role, letting them think they'd crushed me. Then their phones buzzed. Ethan glanced at his, chuckling. "Nate's losing it. Says his wife's mentee is tanking." Nathan's text, sent from a Fremont bar, burned through me. I left my thanks barely audible, but my mind was electric. Nexus was a cult exalting Nathan's clique while stomping on dreamers. That interview wasn't a defeat, it was a lens exposing the rot I'd let grow. But it shook me too. Alone that night, staring at Zoe's latest decrypt, a port schedule for cargo, I wavered. 5 years of playing small had hollowed me out. Was this justice or obsession? I almost called Lauren, ready to bail. But Rachel Park's story stopped me. Zoe dug up Rachel's exit file, a data scientist Nathan forced out. For flagging billing anomalies, he'd threatened her visa, her family, until she broke. I met her at a Tacoma cafe, posing as a whistleblower, not the CEO. Her hands shook as she spoke. "He said I'd never code again," she whispered. I believed him. Her fury mirrored mine. "I'm done hiding," she said, agreeing to help. Rachel wasn't just a witness. She was proof Nathan didn't just betray Nexus. He betrayed everyone who dared to shine. The stakes skyrocketed. Last week, Ethan hired a cybersecurity firm to audit our servers, sniffing for leaks. Zoe's script held cloaked in layers of obfuscated code, but I didn't sleep expecting Nathan's fist on my door. At home, he was colder, his jabs sharper. "You're slipping, Claire," he said over takeout. His eyes searching. "Something on your mind?" I deflected, my voice light, but my gut twisted. Doubt gnawed harder. I'd lied to Lauren, Rachel, even Zoe, to protect this secret. Was I saving Nexus or destroying myself? Then Zoe's breakthrough landed, audio from a Belltown dive bar, Nathan boasting to Shade. The eyes locked, ports ready. Shade's reply was ice. "No errors, Hayes, or you're finished." I listened in my Subaru parked near the port, the cranes looming like sentinels. My hands trembled. This wasn't just about Nexus, that I could crack banks, grids, lives. Nathan didn't care. He wanted his payout, his crown, and he thought I'd stay his shadow. The Seattle Convention Center meeting is tomorrow. I've got Zoe's files, Rachel's story, Lauren's trust, but fear whispers, what if I'm not enough? What if I've crossed a line I can't uncross? I grip the wheel. Nathan's laughter echoing. He's underestimated me for 5 years. Tomorrow I'll show him who I am, and he'll wish he'd seen me coming. The Seattle Convention Center's Summit Hall thrums with restless energy, its soaring glass walls, framing a city cloaked in dawn's gray drizzle. Shareholders fill the tiered seats, their murmurs sharp with anticipation, their laptops open to Nexus Innovations, skyrocketing cloud metrics. I stand at the head of a cedar conference table, my tailored slate blazer sharp, my posture unyielding. Gone are the thrift store sweaters and timid glances. Today, I'm not Claire Evans, the coder, or Sarah Miller, the reject. I'm Claire Thompson, the shadow CEO, who built Nexus, ready to shatter a betrayal that's poisoned my company for too long. Nathan Hayes strides in his charcoal suit, crisp, his smile a calculated shield. Ethan Brooks, Caleb Mitchell, and Ryan Walsh follow, their laughter, a cocky pulse, their confidence, a fortress. They nod to investors, soaking up the room's deference, certain this meeting will crown their reign. Nathan's gaze flicks to me at the podium, and his grin stutters. Why's his wife here, poised like she owns the place? He shakes it off, settling into his VP seat, muttering to Ethan with a smirk. They think they're untouchable, their $20 million AI deal with a Chinese hacking syndicate set to close at the port of Seattle tonight. They're dead wrong. I step to the mic, my voice slicing the chatter. Good morning, let's get started. The room hushes, eyes pinning me. Nathan leans back, one brow arched, amused. I meet his stare, my pulse steady. Nathan, Ethan, Caleb, Ryan. Stay put. You won't want to miss this. My tone is iron, and Nathan's smirk fades, his fingers twitching on his water glass. His crew shifts, their bravado cracking. Shareholders exchange glances, the air thick with unease. I place a sleek USB drive on the table, its weight heavy with truth. Before we talk growth, I say I owe you clarity, a true introduction. I pause, the silence suffocating. I'm Claire Thompson, founder and CEO of Nexus Innovations. Gasps erupt, a shockwave through the hall. Nathan's glass slips, water pooling. Ethan's jaw clenches, his pen frozen. Caleb's eyes dart to the exits. Ryan whispers, "No way." Shareholders scramble, flipping through programs, confusion spiking. Lauren Kim, my proxy COO, sits in the front row, her nod a quiet anchor. She's guarded my secret for years. For 5 years, I press on my voice, calm but blazing. I've run Nexus through a proxy to shield it from vultures. But I've seen it fester, with greed, with treason, with men who thought they could steal my work. I press the USB into a port, and the massive LED wall flares. Evidence floods the screen, decrypted texts, crypto transfers, port schedules. Nathan's voice, smug, in a Belltown dive bar booms. The eyes locked, ports ready. A drone shot shows him at the Port of Seattle meeting, shade the buyer. Ethan's Slack brags about rigging invoices. Caleb's email confirms the $20 million sale. Ryan's burner app whines about delays. The room's a crypt, stunned, silent. Shareholders gape, faces pale. Nathan's hands shake, his breath shallow. "This is a lie," he stammers, his voice fraying. I step closer, my eyes locked on his. For a year, I've hunted your secrets, every stolen dollar, every coded text, every plan to sell our AI to hackers who'd gut the world with it. You thought I was your joke, Nathan. You thought I was weak. My words are a blade, and he flinches, his mask shattered. He lurches up his chair, scraping. "You can't do this!" He roars, face flushed. "I'm the VP. I built this, shareholders." Stare their faith in him, ash. I don't waver. You built nothing. I say, my voice low, lethal. I coded the platform. I won the contracts. I created Nexus. You're a traitor. I slide termination letters across the table, each one signed final. Effective immediately, Nathan Hayes, Ethan Brooks. Caleb Mitchell and Ryan Walsh are done. Nathan slams the table, his voice a snarl. "You'll regret this, Claire." But security, my team steps in, hands firm. Ethan mutters, "This won't hold up." Caleb's head drops, sweat dripping. Ryan's frozen, his phone clattering. Then a voice cuts through. She's telling the truth. Rachel Park rises from the back, her eyes fierce. The room gasps. Rachel, the data scientist, Nathan crushed for questioning his billing. I called her yesterday, pleading for her voice. "Nathan blackmailed me," she says, unwavering. "He threatened my family when I saw his lies." Claire's fighting for us all. Nathan's gaze snaps to Rachel, his panic raw. He turns to his crew, desperate, but they're broken. Ethan staring down, Caleb trembling, Ryan mute. Shareholders erupt, shouting, demanding answers. I raise a hand, silencing them. Last night, I tipped the feds. I say, my voice cold. They're at the port of Seattle now, taking down shade. Your deal's over. Nathan staggers his breath, a rasp his world imploding. Security moves, escorting them out. Nathan fights, yelling, "This isn't done," but his voice fades as the doors slam. The room exhales tension, snapping. I face the shareholders, my voice steady but raw. Nexus is ours. We'll rebuild it true. Strong ours. Applause surges tentative, then fierce. Rachel's eyes meet mine, her nod a quiet vow. But my hands tremble behind the podium. I won, but the cost my marriage. My trust, maybe, my soul burns. Nathan's gone, but a shadow lingers. Did I break more than I built? The screen dims, but the fight's not done. Not yet. The Seattle skyline shimmers through a veil of mist, its lights dancing across the Puget Sound as I stand in my office atop Nexus Innovations headquarters. The open plan floors below buzz with coders trading ideas over cold brew their energy, a pulse that keeps this place alive. 5 weeks have passed since the Seattle Convention Center showdown, where I unmasked Nathan Hayes and his crew, exposing their plot to sell my AI to a Chinese hacking syndicate. Nexus is breathing again, but the scars of that fight, doubt, loss, isolation, linger like rain on my skin. I'm Claire Thompson, no longer the shadow CEO or Nathan's mocked wife. I'm the woman who reclaimed her company, but victory carries a weight I didn't expect. Nathan's fall was swift, a house of cards in a storm. My evidence texts crypto trails that Belltown bar audio hit the feds like a lightning strike. By midnight, they'd raided the port of Seattle, nabbing Shade and his crew before the AII handoff. GeekWire screamed Nexus VP's cybercrime plot busted. The Seattle Times dubbed it tech's betrayal of the decade. Nathan Ethan Brooks, Caleb Mitchell, and Ryan Walsh became untouchables, their 5-year non-competes a career guillotine. X dug up their old boasts. Nathan's TEDx talk, Ethan's disruptor rants, turning them into memes of failure. Lauren, Nathan's wife, filed for divorce, claiming their Belltown loft and his vintage Porsche. Now he's a barista at a Tacoma Starbucks, his face drawn, his charm buried under an apron. Ethan's mired in lawsuits, his Mercer Island condo on the market. Caleb's dodging creditors in Spokane. Ryan's delivering DoorDash in Everett, his tech dreams dead. They're not just fired, they're forgotten. But their collapse isn't my prize. Nexus is. The day after the purge, I stood in our Pioneer Square. Atrium 700 employees staring back their eyes, a mix of shock and hope. My voice shook but held. I'm Claire Thompson, your CEO. I built Nexus to protect, not to plunder. We're done with bullies. We're building true. The applause roared, a dam breaking after years of fear. I axed every enabler HR suits who buried complaints, managers who bowed to Nathan. By dusk, 10 were gone, their access revoked. Rachel Park was my first call. Nathan crushed her for questioning his invoices, threatening her visa until she quit. Over a shaky Zoom, her voice cracked. You're serious? You want me back? I nodded. Not just back, Rachel. Lead our AI team. She walked into Nexus a week later, her stride fierce. Her team's new cloud security model, demoed yesterday, could block zero-day attacks in real time, drawing Pentagon interest. She's not just a coder, she's a fire starter, reigniting my vision. The culture's shifting, but it's a tightrope. I launched Nexus Voice, an anonymous reporting app, nabbing 2 toxic managers in its first week. They're out. Code together. My mentorship program pairs veterans like Rachel with newbies, no egos, just ideas. Last week, I saw an intern pitch a quantum-resistant encryption tool over pizza unafraid. That's my nexus. But some coders whisper, I'm too ruthless, my reforms too fast. A senior dev quit calling me obsessed. I feel it too. Nights in my Capitol Hill apartment, once Nathan's home, are silent. I found his old UW cap last week, and for a moment, I saw the man I loved before greed twisted him. Did I destroy too much? Was justice worth my heart? The numbers don't doubt. We landed a $180 million deal with a Seattle cloud provider. A client Nathan's arrogance lost. Our stocks up, thus VCs buzzing. But my real win is the Thompson Code Fund, my $10 million pledge to kids from Rainier Valley White Center, places where dreams code on borrowed laptops. We've got 1-800 applications, one from a 16-year-old in Kent, building an app to track homeless shelters. She's meeting Rachel tomorrow. This isn't charity, it's my past mocked, as Claire Evans fueling a future for others. But the cost haunts me. 5 years of lies burned my marriage, my trust, my peace. I almost broke at the convention center, my hands shaking as Nathan screamed. Was I saving Nexus or chasing vengeance? The question lingers a shadow in my quiet apartment. I chose my company over him, but the emptiness echoes. Still I see Rachel's team, the intern's laughter, the fund's first scholar. That's my fight now. I turn from the window, my desk piled with Rachel's specs, a new Azure contract, a scholarship shortlist. Nexus is alive but fragile. Some board members question my pace, whispering about stability. A junior coder hesitated to report a lead, fearing retaliation. The work's not done. I'm not a hero, just a coder who fought for her truth. Rachel's note, keep building. Claire sticks to my screen, a quiet tether. I'm still learning, still healing, still me. The Seattle night wraps the city in a soft drizzle, its lights flickering like code across the Puget Sound. From my office high in Nexus Innovations' Pioneer Square headquarters, I watch ferries glide through the dark, their horns a faint echo of resilience. 6 months have passed since the Seattle Convention Center showdown, where I unmasked Nathan Hayes and his crew, shattering their plot to sell my AI to a Chinese hacking syndicate. Nexus breathes freely now, its halls alive with coders chasing breakthroughs. But the weight of that victory loss, doubt, solitude, clings to me like damp air. I'm Claire Thompson, no longer the shadow CEO or Nathan's mocked wife. I'm the woman who reclaimed her dream, but the cost still stings. Nathan's world is rubble. The feds, armed with my evidence, killed his $20 million deal at the Port of Seattle, snaring shade in his syndicate before dawn. Puget Sound Business Journal blared Nexus VP's treasonous fall. X turned Nathan Ethan Brooks, Caleb Mitchell, and Ryan Walsh into cautionary tales their old keynotes mocked as fraud. 5-year non-competes exiled them from tech. Nathan's wife Lauren took their Belltown loft in a brutal divorce, leaving him nothing. Now he's a stock clerk at a Renton Costco, his face hollow, his swagger erased. Ethan's buried in legal debt, Caleb's hiding from bailiffs in Yakima Ryan's washing dishes in Bellingham. They're not just gone, they're invisible. I don't dwell on their ruin, it's not my triumph. Nexus is 6 months on my company's a beacon, its cloud platform securing global networks, its AI outpacing rivals. Rachel Park's team just rolled out a predictive firewall sharp enough to snag NSA interest. Our stock's up 42%, a $220 million deal with a Tacoma cloud giant sealed last week. The Thompson Code Fund, my $10 million bet, On kids from Skyway Burien places where talent codes on library Wi-Fi has 200 applicants. A 17-year-old from Auburn built an app to crowdsource legal aid. She's interning with Rachel next month. These wins are my pulse, but they're tender. Some coders grumble, my reforms are too swift, my purges too cold. A lead dev quit calling me driven to a fault. I hear them, I question myself too. The price I paid cuts deep. 5 years of hiding as Claire Evans stole my marriage, my trust, my peace. I lied to Rachel Lauren Kim, even Zoe Chen, to shield my plan. My Capitol Hill apartment, once Nathan's home, is a quiet cage. I found his old mixtape last night, Springsteen tracks we'd sing to, and for a moment I saw the man I loved before ambition broke him. I wanted to save him once, but he chose greed and I chose Nexus. That choice saved my company, but left me raw. At the convention center, as Nathan screamed, I nearly faltered, my heart pounding with doubt. Was I just, or was I cruel? The silence in my life now whispers that question. These scars carved lessons I hold tight, and I want you to take them. First, own your truth. Nathan's jabs tried to shrink me, but I knew my worth. Don't let anyone rewrite yours. Second, timing is strength. I waited, built my case, struck when iron hot. Your moment's coming, be ready. Third, justice has a cost. Exposing Nathan broke my world but saved Nexus. Fight for right even when it bleeds. Fourth, raise the overlooked. My fund lifts kids the world ignores because I was one. Find someone to champion and you'll grow too. Finally, turn pain into power. My hurt forged a better Nexus. Let your wounds build something bold. I step from the window, my desk stacked with Rachel's mock-ups, a new GCP contract, a scholarship pitch. Nexus thrives, but it's fragile. A board member hinted, I'm too intense, eyeing my toll. A rookie coder froze before reporting a toxic lead, scared of pushback. The fight's not over. I'm no saint, just a coder who clawed back her truth. Rachel's note, keep dreaming, Claire clings to my monitor, a quiet spark. I'm still growing, still mending, still me. What's your battle faced, a Nathan, a lie? A moment you stood tall, share below, let's fuel each other. Keep watching for stories of grit and truth. This isn't my finish line, it's my next commit.